Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As many of us approach midlife, we find ourselves stretching back to our past at a time of yesteryear when it brought smiles to our face and life seemed a lot simpler then. We found things to keep ourselves entertained, whether you were perhaps like me, down by a creek catching frogs and snakes and bugs and driving your mother crazy with all the little mishaps and adventures that you got into. Perhaps you were playing hopscotch with the neighborhood kids or just swinging on a swing set. Whatever it was for you, me, and anybody else who is about beyond 50, we do realize that today we're into a time and an age where those simple things just sort of seem to be on the back burner and disappearing slowly. With the age of iPhones, Xboxes, and Sega Play systems, it makes anybody wonder when anybody will ever get back to the simple things of life. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is Jane Ferrer. Her book is Stone Skipping and Other Fun Old-Time Games. We're going to be talking about things that perhaps you've heard of and other things you'll kind of find interesting and new. Jane, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Oh, thank you for having me, Daniel. Appreciate it.
Now, tell us how you came to create the art of stone skipping. What was the reason behind that? You obviously must have seen a need out there.
Well, my publisher actually saw the need, and he knew that I love to do research, and that I'm just a big proponent of family interaction, and so he asked if this was a book I was interested in pursuing, and I absolutely was. There are a lot of game books out there, but I discovered that there weren't many that had instructions that were simple enough for children as well as adults. And there was nothing that had the history and the background of the games, which to me is really the most important and most interesting fact is that these games have been around for centuries.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Now, tell us how you decided to choose the ones you did. Was this sort of like a top 100 or because I noticed that you kind of arrange it in great categories, you know, like one that really jumped out at me, and I was just talking with my wife about this last night. When I was growing up, especially when my mom at one point was a single mom, we used to take long trips, you know, out camping and so forth, and this would be several hours to get to a destination, and of course, back in the 1970s, you didn't have a DVD player hanging from the ceiling in quadraphonic sound, you know, like they do today, and iPhones and cell phones and things to keep you occupied. You know, you had the radio. It was probably AM. We didn't have a cassette player in there, so she would bring a portable cassette player, so you got to know groups such as the Coasters and the Big Bopper. But in the meantime, you still had hours to kill on the way to the trip, and we certainly weren't the kind of kids who were like, are we there yet?
Organizing the book was really the biggest challenge because there were so many games, and obviously, the games that I was familiar with, and then those that I played with my children went on the top of my list. And then, again, card games is probably where I first started categorizing because I remember just those long, interminably long stretches on highway, and I lived in a little bitty town, so we had to drive a long way to get to anywhere.
You must have lived in Nebraska, right?
No, I was actually in Central Florida, but it was a little agricultural town. So if you wanted to go to a movie or a really nice restaurant or do any serious shopping, you had to get in the car, and it meant at least a 30, 45-minute drive.
Mm-hmm.
So my game was Birds on a Wire, which is you claim your side depending on where you're sitting in the car and then count the birds, and if they leave in the middle of you counting, you lose the points. They go to your opponent, whatever. And I discovered that in other parts of the country, there's a variation on that game called cowpoker. And it's kind of the same principle, except when you pass a cemetery, you lose all your points. So those things, any idea of keeping kids occupied and engaged as you go along, kind of set the stage for where I started, and then I just kind of categorized by, okay, there are ball games, there are games that you play by yourself, there are games that you need a partner to play. Musical chairs was a big favorite at my church growing up, so that was a favorite. And I just kind of started canvassing everybody I knew to find out what games were near and dear to their hearts and what ones that they had the best memories of.
Mm-hmm. When you think of something like this, especially trying to bring a book perhaps like this to a younger generation of children, parents might feel a sense of, I don't know, frustration maybe because they're like, I could never get my kids to play any of these games. What has been the response, in relation to that?
The response has been very positive, but I know what you mean because one of the very first reviewers who looked at the book said, my kids are never going to, take to this. This is just way too dull. And my son, when he first looked at it, he said, this is how you guys kept yourself busy when you were little.
Yeah, really.
But then what happens is when you introduce them to the game, when you actually sit them down and say, okay, here are the rules and here's how you play, they are immediately engaged, and they end up laughing, and it's fun. It's so unfamiliar to this youngest generation. They've never played things like Statue. And now my guys who were, my youngest one is now in his early 20s, Foursquare, they had played a lot. Of course, everybody's Bob for Apples, but a lot of these games, Beggar My Neighbor and Dots and Boxes and Scavenger Hunts, which, oh my goodness, Scavenger Hunts was one of my favorite things to do when I was growing up. That's not something they've been exposed to, but as soon as they discover it's out there, they've really embraced it.
Now, you mentioned Foursquare, and it's interesting when you think about a game like Foursquare, you think about for handball or even badminton. And just for some of our listeners out there that probably are familiar with these, these games, when you play them at a high level, are actually a heck of a lot more challenging than they sound.
Oh, very much.
And, like, for instance, my wife was saying, well, what's Foursquare? And I said, well, it starts out with 4 people, and there's 4 squares that you stand in, and you have a ball, and the idea is that you bat it back and forth. You pick, and it's kind of like handball. I mean, you know how the game is played. But, it's reducing the amount of players, and it could get to be really tricky, and you really got to have some good coordination and speed and endurance, the whole bit. And, badminton was very much the same thing. I remember thinking, even this was when I was a kid, well, this is kind of silly. You just kind of lob this thing. And then by the time I got in the 6th or 7th grade, they had it in PE class, and I realized this takes wicked determination to do, and I mean, I really enjoyed it, and that was what was really exciting about it. But talk about some of those games that really take, like the hand-eye coordination and skill, like jacks, a real simple one that doesn't take a whole lot of space.
But it does take a lot of skill. I mean, and the wonderful thing about all of these tried and true games is that you can play them at whatever level of competition you want to. If you've got little children or elderly people whose energy level is maybe not going to be that of a 16 or 18-year-old, you just scale it back. Conversely, if you've got a bunch of competitive guys out there, they can just take it to the max. And a lot of these games, particularly the ball games, have professional leagues and organizations. Volleyball, for example, and some of the other ones I'm looking, kickball.
And then one of them is even featured in major motion pictures, stickball.
Yeah. And heaven knows that started out with about as simple a format as you can get, but it just depends on what you want to put in it. The nice thing that I like about these games is that you can change the equipment out, you can change the rules, and I put a lot of the variations in here, but the idea is that you customize it for what your situation is, either your family or your youth group or whatever, so that it addresses, what you're trying to accomplish. And if that's just everybody playing and have a good time, you can pitch the rules and who's the winner out the window and just focus on the experience of the game itself.
Now, as you were saying, when parents would actually engage their kids in some of these games, give us an idea of if you had any comments that came from parents or perhaps even kids like, I thought this here was a grandma or grandpa's kind of a game, but this is really a lot of fun. What kind of response did you get from that side?
Well, what's been really fun to see is that at my book signings, anytime a store has the room, we've encouraged them to set up game tables or, draw hopscotch grids outside or whatever. And it's the adults that just immediately respond. We've had great revelations. One of my best friends, it turns out she was a jacks queen when she was in elementary school. And, that part of her has been hidden for the last several decades.
Didn't quite get the prom, but the jacks, she's got that one down.
That's right. And it's funny to see, adults who haven't jumped hopscotch in 30 years, this big smile comes on their face, and they're like, I used to love this. And they come out, and then the children are fascinated because they've not seen their parents in a role like this maybe, or even more so the grandparents. I've had a couple of situations where I've had, 70, 75-year-olds just step up to the plate and just, show people how it's done. And these kids are just mesmerized to see that, that their parents know something, their grandparents know something that they've totally missed out on. So I think it offers a wonderful opportunity. And I don't know if you saw the movie Parental Guidance, where they all end up playing kick the can. Billy Crystal and Bette Midler are grandparents for these kids that have lived this rigid, everything has to be done in order life, and they're like, just get out and run and play with it. And once they get past the unfamiliarity and it's like, are you crazy? They just loved it.
Mm-hmm. See, and you're starting to really have a real difference emerge between, let's say today's technologically driven society and the days of old, because, today with a cell phone or a video game console, it's really more of a one-on-one thing. I mean, even when the science first started back in the early 1970s, of course, with video pong, it was still sort of a two-player situation there, but is that it gets real isolated and individual, and people might argue, well, those games take skill, and I say, well, no, they take a passive form of skill, whereas this takes a lot more interaction and sort of instinct. Like, for instance, when you think about the card games that you feature here in the book.
Oh yeah, and spades. I couldn't wait until my children were old enough to play spades. I grew up in a very traditional household, and we didn't play cards in my house. My mother was not keen on that, and she thought they had bad connotations and association with them. So I remember the summer one of my older cousins taught me how to play spades. And it was like a whole new world opened up for me. And when I married my husband, his whole family, he came from a large family, and playing games was very much a part of their tradition.
Now, tell me, of all the games that you put into this book here, tell me some of the ones that go back the longest.
In terms of the history of the game?
Yeah, the history of the game, yes.
Well, playing ball goes back, oh, goodness gracious, to like 400 BC, 2000 BC, even board games.
Sounds like we have just a little bit of interference going on there. That must be a telephone game that we're playing.
Okay. And in ancient China, they used the game pickup sticks. They would carve these elaborate, ornate sticks out of ivory. And I'm trying to think of some of the other kickball, things like that, are just played all over the world. Every continent seems to have a variation of that. It's interesting to see that some of the ball games actually were worked into religious rituals and could get kind of savage at some point because they took winning very seriously. Mm-hmm. Hopefully we've scaled that back so it's not quite as much. A lot of the card games, a lot of the parlor in the 16th, 17th century, and you'll find a lot of these games played too in the early days of America. All of them have just kind of transcended time and adapted as we move along. And, things like Hangman is actually what Wheel of Fortune is. So it depends on what level of technology you insert into it to bring it to the new generation.
As a matter of fact, that's exactly what Merv Griffin said he created the concept from. He was playing Hangman one day, and all of a sudden it just clicked in Wheel of Fortune. And here we are, 30-some-odd years later, and the game is still thriving and moving and doing its thing. Now, what were the ones that were some of your favorite things?
I absolutely love to play Red Rover.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. In fact, it's been since I lived in Texas as a kindergartner that I played that, I think.
And Marco Polo, if you were in the water. I didn't do a water game section in this book, so if I do a sequel, I'll have to include those. And I love to play freeze tag and statue. As I said, musical chairs, that was a favorite. We always played that at church. And after church on Sunday nights when the grown-ups all wanted to stand around and talk, we'd go out into the parking lot and on the sidewalk and play red light, green light, and Mother May I, and of others that I was particularly fond of. Some of the parlor games, the Minister's Cat, I actually did not play growing up, so that was fun to learn about that. I think I actually first heard about that in the movie Scrooge with Albert Finney and Alec Guinness. They play a version of the Minister's Cat in there.
Tell us about the Minister's Cat. Like I said, there are games in here that I had never even heard of before.
Well, that one you only need 2 players. It's more fun if you get more players involved, and you don't need any equipment at all. You start clapping, just a rhythmic clap, and the first person says, the minister's cat is a something cat, and you fill in the blank with any kind of an adjective that starts with A. So, for example, the minister's cat is an arrogant cat. And then you move to the next person, all the while still clapping, and the next person says, the minister's cat is a benevolent cat. And then you just work your way all the way through the alphabet. And it's the rhythm of the clapping is what kind of adds the weight and the pressure there, because there's something about that that's just like a timer ticking down. It just kind of makes it's like having something waved in your face, and so the pressure gets a little intense. But that's a fun game. And in fact, I had a young woman who does a lot of social gatherings, and she said that's one of her favorites because no matter what the age group is, people always seem to respond and enjoy that game.
Mm-hmm. I know in the neighborhood I grew up in Los Angeles, one of the favorite games that we enjoyed playing, and it's kind of I don't know, just something we made up with between, it was tag, it was actually called ball tag, but we also blended that with the idea of hide and seek. So the whole idea is that as a group of kids, what we would do is we would just set up boundaries, that you couldn't go outside of, but we would play within our own neighborhood block. So if you went outside this one area here, for instance, and you were out of bounds, you were automatically it. And depending on how challenging we wanted to make it, it would start out with either 1 ball or have up to maybe 3. And the idea, of course, if you get hit by the ball, then you're automatically it. And this would be something you could play for an hour or so, and the idea also is that you can hide at the same time. And what I really enjoyed about playing the game is the fact that I'd try to hide in such a way where I was right there in front of you, but you just didn't see me while I was watching everybody else getting tagged. And then after a while you get a little bored, so you'd put yourself out there, so you could get chased down and see if anybody had the agility and the accuracy to be able to nail you, sort of thing. But it was just such an interesting, fun game, because it moved, quite a bit while also being still at the same time.
Well, and again, that's what's fun about this is you learn from playing with other people. You see their creativity and, maybe things that you would not have thought of. And so the next time you play that game, you've got some new information to work with. Mm-hmm. I think that the technology and the video games are here to stay, and unlike a lot of people, I don't find that a negative at all. I think those games have their place, but, if you add these games to your armory, then, you've expanded for those times when, I know here in South Carolina, our power goes out in the winter a lot of times, and it's not uncommon for us to be without power for a week in an ice storm.
Wow.
With no electricity and no batteries, boredom sets in pretty quickly, and with this you have this endless supply, and again, if it's snowing and you can't go outside, then you do things, you just kind of switch the rules around. And another thing I think that's really special is that playing games, and we adults are so reluctant to do that, we just take ourselves so seriously. It gives you a chance to see people in a different situation. Like, how often does your child see you fail and in a situation that you can laugh about it? Or, maybe you and your son butt head-to-heads on things, but if you have a chance to sit down and, and play a card game together, then you end up laughing, and that competition can take a different direction. Mm-hmm. So, lots of possibilities.
It was like I had a version of the shell game with my 2 children when it came to getting movies. If I'd take them out to the video store, for instance, and they got to pick 1, maybe 2 movies each as they were with me for the weekend. And, of course, the fight's going to ensue, well, who gets to watch theirs first? And the simple solution to that problem is I'd say, well, go wait in the living room, and then I'd go in the kitchen, and then I'd pick a couple of cupboards, okay, and that's where I would put the movies. So it was like, what's behind door number 1, door number 2, door number 3? And then to be even more fair, what I would do is then I would flip a coin so we could decide who gets to choose the door first. So, you didn't know which movie was behind which door. You just knew which door a movie was behind. And then you'd flip the coin, and so they seen that as totally fair, and we never, ever had an argument or a fight over something like that.
Yeah.
I think about that as a prize. But now you're stuck with Netflix, so now you got to decide who gets to click the mouse, I guess.
Yeah, I got to insert it somewhere else. Well, here's a fact I just learned recently, and take this in a slightly different direction. A lack of play has been exposed as a significant factor in predicting criminal behavior in people.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, it's like when you're not exposed, when you don't have the opportunity to play, and you see in grown-ups, again, in doing research for the book, for adults to play games, it lowers their blood pressure, it lowers stress, it increases your heart level, it decreases depression. There's all of these reasons, which makes you wonder why we're not all doing this. Another fact says that in hunter-gatherer communities, there was about 4 hours a day of work, and the rest of those hours, daylight hours, they were spent playing games.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just something that we've lost in this society. We've gotten so serious about our work. We look at it as leisure or as an extra, and it's really not. It's very integral for us to play and laugh in particular.
Well, it's interesting, too, when you think about this, Jane, is there was a time that I worked in the food service industry, as a food server, bartender. I've done pretty much all of it. And there was at least 2 places I had worked where I had served, working as a waiter, and they managed to find ways to really add a level of fun to it, because it should be a fun job in the first place, or your guests just aren't enjoying themselves. But there'd be the one place that I had worked, what they would do is they would put up a list of trivia questions. And, of course, the first one who could come up with the correct answers would get free dinner, free lunch, whatever the case may be. And then one of the most fascinating ones that they came up, and I know as I was looking through your book this week, is that you had car bingo. And we actually used to play that at the restaurant, where everybody would get a bingo card, and in each of the squares you had to sell a specific thing to win that square. And one time the bingo was so elaborate that when you got a blackout that you actually had a weekend stay at a winery. Wow. We're talking about their 4-bedroom, really nice estate house. You got to stay there with you, your girlfriend, your wife, whoever it was, and whoever else you wanted to invite. You had the whole house to yourself on a wine vineyard. But along the way, what you did is each time you got a bingo, you got to choose, or they'd put up a square where you'd sign your name as you got a bingo, and then they would look on that card and take you back in the office and say, well, according to that square, you've won this bottle of wine. Okay, so there was that, and then there was also gift cards that were given out. We're talking $50, $100. So it really, there was real incentive to play the game, but what was funny, Jane, is that I was so good that I was constantly winning these bingos. But what I was doing was I was actually giving the prizes eventually away, because I found there was a unique focus and intensity to doing the job well enough to be able to sell these specific things. Mm-hmm. And like you said, with work, we take it all so seriously, and it's like, I'll bet you the work environment would change incredibly if you would just start infusing things like that in such a way people would just realize their creativity is just, comes bursting out at the seams. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would love to see this book go in the closet at every corporate building, every office building, because one of the things that you will discover is that we're more likely to cooperate with someone in your real-life setting if you've played a game with them or been on a team, something where you have to cooperate and work together, mm-hmm. or you've seen kind of a different side of that person.
And nothing like The Apprentice. Let's play as a team while you stab each other in the back of the boardroom. Yeah, that's a real cultivating culture there.
Not quite the same thing. But, if you could, and that's happened to me where I've been teamed up with, somebody that was not my favorite person in the office, mm-hmm. But we got put on a team together, and and when you have to collaborate and you're forced to be on the same side, you've got to find some way to work in a relationship there. So I think game playing is probably very much underutilized in an office setting. You don't want people sitting around all day playing, coin flipping or juggling in the corner. But I do think it does create a much more welcoming environment if people know that there's a little humor and they can interject a little fun into their day.
Well, and I was just thinking about this too. For instance, there might be a particular day where your boss says, if you're working in an office, when you get up from your desk to walk anywhere within, the office building, that you have to do it using can stilts. Or another thing, if you want to go up and talk to your boss, or you go to talk to any other employee, you got your jacks sitting there. Well, if you can go ahead and capture 6 jacks in the ball, then you can tell me what's on your mind.
Yeah.
And you only get one shot at that. Otherwise, you can come back and see me tomorrow. But, that would actually break the tension, I would think, especially if you're asking for a raise. Who knows?
Well, and just in general, things get really tense, and especially in the summer months when it's just so hot,
mm-hmm.
And tempers kind of flare, and, there's nothing wrong at all with just saying, you know what, we're going to take 15 minutes here and just chill. Let's play a quick game of I Spy, or, hide something. We did an Easter egg at the company that I'm working with now, an Easter egg hunt. But there's so many ways, and again, you can adapt to how many people you have, or the level of intensity that you want it to have. And I can't think of any environment in which a good game wouldn't be a positive thing.
And I couldn't agree with you more, Jane, because just like you said, here you get criminal behavior on the rise because people don't get a chance to play. They may be engaged too long, too seriously in the beta state of mind, rather than, kind of getting into some of those other areas that bring imagination, of course, to a situation.
Yeah, well, and disconnectedness and depression are such very real conditions that people deal with. And as you mentioned earlier when we started talking, we're so isolated in our lives these days. We use machines for everything. We use robots. We're not talking to humans. And if you live by yourself, if your family is gone, if your spouse is deceased, you may not have an opportunity to interact with people. And it's just astonishing at how engaged someone will become if they're given the opportunity. But, we have to provide those opportunities for them. And that works with adults as well as with children. It's a way to pull people in. Now,
tell us, first of all, where people can find and get a hold of this book, and do you also have a website?
I do. My own personal website. It's so long they'll probably have to look it up. It's janejadonferrer.com. And maybe you can put that on your site so people can spell that out. But the book, The Art of Stone Skipping and Other Fun Old-Time Games, is available at any bookstore. It's available at online bookstores as well as in your local independent or chain store. And if they don't have it on the shelf, all you need to do is ask for it. It's also carried in a number of toy stores and probably some of the big box stores as well. And you can also, the publisher is Charles Bridge Publishing. Imagine is an imprint of theirs, and you can go to the Charles Bridge site, and it's available there as well.
And for any of you listeners who can recite back to her in person exactly all the places you can find this book, she'll give you a free copy. How does that sound?
And the one neat thing about this, too, Daniel, it's available as paperback, retails, I think, for $14.95, but it's also available as an e-book, which I think is kind of neat because if you're a coach out on a field, you can just whip your smartphone out of your pocket and review the rules right there.
Very good. Jay, we want to thank you so much for skipping stones with us today and other old-time games. I'm sure that it's nice to know for our listeners out there that there's something there that they can get that connection going again, and that sense of child play and imagination working in their favor as well.
That's
Thanks
right.
again for being on the program.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
You bet. We also want to thank you, the listeners out there. Be sure to visit us at Beyond50Radio.com. The number 50. We'll go ahead and have a hard link up there for you so you can find out more about stone skipping and other fun old-time games. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.